The Grandparent's House and the Mystery of the Candles, Part 1. Hello friends, the following story I'm going to tell you is about the daily life of a young man named Angel Reyes. I hope you don't ask me for many explanations since I don't have them, and of course I would like to have them. I would like to understand and make sense of all this chaos. God knows I've tried. My family is stubbornly boring. I don't mean that in a bad way. On the contrary, that absence of problems has had a very quiet life. We're not rich, but we've never lacked anything. We don't have luxurious vacations, but we can visit the family at least once a year. My parents have a happy marriage. There's not much to tell, and I thought for a long time that we all had such a life, all the family members. At least at the beginning of the year 2022, I realized that it wasn't so, and that this is where the mystery begins. It all started with a photography workshop. They made me choose someone from my family and take pictures of that character and his environment to try to capture the essence of his personality. Thinking of someone interesting, I asked my grandfather to take pictures of him. Although my grandparents were like us, extremely quiet, that house of more than 150 years was already a character. At least that's what I thought then. I took some pictures of my grandfather and it was time to eat. Grandma prepared chicken broth for me, and she was very happy that I visited them. Once as a child, I told her as a courtesy that the chicken broth was very good, and since then she thought it was my favorite dish. Whenever she knew I would visit, she'd prepare it for me. She's so cute. In the street, suddenly there was a scandal. A boy had tried to rob the house of an old man near the corner. I didn't count that all day that man's children were there. They chased him in front of the grandparents' house and were giving him a tremendous beating. My grandfather was a very sensible man. He went out to ask them to wait for the police. At the end of the day, there was always the doubt, he said. Maybe he stole because he likes easy money or because of real need. That's what he always told us. I wanted to leave, but my grandmother stopped me. She asked me to wait inside and she told me to go back into my grandmother's house. She asked me to wait inside and I had to go into the house, listening to the screams behind those huge wooden doors. The house looks more like a convent, an old hotel than a house, but it had always belonged to the family. From the main entrance that faces the street, there are two corridors, one on the left of the bedrooms and another to the right of the kitchen. Dining room and living room in the center, there was a door to the small central garden with a fountain with an angel that, since I could remember, has caused me a lot of fear. I decided to finally ignore the hustle and bustle and continue with the photo session. I approached the angel as always with some nervousness and took some pictures. The light at the moment was perfect, and suddenly in the background, out of focus, through the camera I saw someone passing towards my grandparents' bedrooms. I lowered the camera and saw nothing, but I decided to approach that side of the house, usually always closed for visitors. My grandparents, for some reason, always sleep in separate rooms, one door in front of the other. At the end of the hallway, and in the front of both doors, the entrance to a smaller cellar that I had never entered. I thought that maybe it was time to do it. By talks that I had heard, I understood that they kept some photographs and old things that at some point my mother used it as a study, and that among other things, they kept the things that the former inhabitants of that house were leaving over more than 100 years. When I approached the door, I didn't know how to explain it. I felt as if someone was calling me from inside, and at the same time as if someone was pushing me by the chest as if I could not come any closer. Angel, the sound of someone calling me and by my name, and my back froze my blood. Stunned, I only felt hands grab my shoulders, and I screamed before realizing that it was my grandmother. She never scolded me so much. She told me that he would not tell my parents. But even she had asked me to leave the house at that moment. She didn't make me chicken broth again in any of the other visits. That was what hurt me the most. At the end of the year, she died without having forgiven me. She died on December 30th, and on the 31st of December, while the families gathered to wait for another year coming, mine was also gathered, but for another reason. At my grandmother's wake, we talked with the cousins remembering Grandma, especially the five of us who were almost the same age. The five of us were going to college at the time, and in the middle of the memories, I told them for the first time about the conflict I had with Grandma. That invasion of her privacy, innocently on my part, cost me my relationship with her in the last months. Everyone agreed that it wasn't a big deal. And suddenly the voice of Lucia, a cousin that was about 12 years old that we thought was still asleep in her brother's lap, said something that would only complicate things. She said something that would only complicate what she thought, and she told us, by accident, she entered the interior of that room that remained permanently closed since she could remember. It was, according to what she told us, completely upholstered with religious figures, and in the center of the room there was a round table full of lighted candles. We didn't believe her. If our grandparents said something in particular, it was that they were not at all concerned about that kind of religious figures and didn't educate any of their children to the Catholic or Protestant religion, or in which they were educated by their families. We told them that surely she was confused and that she had imagined it or was making it up, but her answer was so clear. She said it even with her closed eyes that if she didn't wake up, well, you wouldn't believe me and go and see for yourselves. At that moment, the house was alone, and we weren't far from the house, about 3 or 4 blocks, so we decided to go and end the curiosity. We told our relatives that we were going to go buy something to eat and ask the grandfather if he needed something for his house. We walked at a hurried pace for some reason without making much noise. I felt hollow in my stomach. I felt like telling them that we better forget about it, that it wasn't worth it. I'm not sure if that night there's no light in the street or if everyone decided to spend New Year's Eve somewhere else, but the street was more deserted and darker than usual. We entered the house and turned on the light. The silence was such that I could hear the sound of the lights. Silence was so deafening I could hear the noise of the bulb. We nervously walked down the hallway to the bedroom. When I looked at that angel in the courtroom, it terrified me. This time I saw him looking directly at me. I don't know if it was the little lighting coming in and my nerves, but I could barely see his face. And instead of a smile, what I saw on his face was an expression of terror or anger, but his mouth was completely open, or at least it was what I could make out in the darkness of night. Suddenly we already were in front of the room with my 4 cousins, Edward, Brian, Lixel, and Daniel. I opened the door and we found the image Lucia had said minutes before. From floor to ceiling, the room was covered by religious images of all kinds. It wasn't necessary to look for the switch to turn the light on. It wasn't necessary to turn on the lights because of the candles that were around the full room that illuminated the sky blue background with paint. And it made us fully appreciate the images, even the most hidden ones. We realized that there were even Hindu images in the corner of the wall, and we all went around the room trying to find out what it meant, but while my cousins were arguing, I could only think of one of the candles that was about to be completely consumed. The wooden gate rang. Someone had come to the house. I ran out of the hallway from where I could see the entrance and patio. It was my grandfather. I ran to tell the others, and we ran out running on tiptoe, and we saw the light in the hallway turn on. My grandfather was a few meters away from us and about to see us. Lixon and Edward barely managed to enter my grandfather's room. Outside of Brian and Daniel, I had to enter my grandmother's room trying to close the door without making much of a noise. If she, my grandmother, who was all love, was so upset with me, I couldn't imagine what my grandfather would do if he realized we, with my other relatives, were watching over his wife. He had betrayed his trust. My grandfather's slow steps approached until he stood in front of the door to which I was glued trying to listen. Suddenly I thought it was likely that he'd come to the house for something of Grandma's or to enter her room to remember her or something like that. And I quickly jumped to the floor to get under the bed. I heard him open one of the other doors. When I was about to peek out and get out from under the bed, he came into the room. I could barely hide. I saw his feet walk towards the center of the room, and I saw him get on his knees. I thought he had seen me and that he'd peek under the bed and pull me out furious, but he just put his hand trying to get something out. He passed his hand very close to my face, and luckily he didn't touch me. When he touched a shoebox, he pulled it out and he left the room. He closed the door and I heard the steps in the hallway. I heard another door close and then he walked away. Minutes later, Brian came in for me and he had to hide under the candle table. He couldn't do anything else. He saw Grandpa came in with a candle. He lit it and left it there. Then he walked away. He lit it, left, and then when I went to see, I noticed the candle that was about to be consumed changed. The one I had concentrated on. There were 46 candles on the table, forming a figure that I couldn't describe. It wasn't something I'd seen before, but it was too precise to be a coincidence. Now that I even was more tormented with doubt, evidently we couldn't commit to it anybody, but What the hell did it mean that all of this was in the room? Because Grandfather took the time to go to change the candle in the house in the middle of his wife's funeral. Because nobody, not even his last children, entered that room. They seemed to have no idea what took on with their grandparents to make it so forbidden in the last time. When, in March of this year, 2023, Grandfather's health suddenly declined. I never thought of questioning Grandpa about it, as suddenly as he arrived at the hospital, he died. The family was almost happy that he came back to join Grandma. Brian was the last one to talk to him, according to what my mom told me when I arrived at the hospital. While my uncles were passing by as they were arriving to the place, my cousin suddenly came in to see him. After a few minutes, he left the room, and by the time Uncle Rodolfo came in, Grandpa had already left. It seems strange to me that Brian, the most rebellious, was the last one to see him. He was always the most distant of all, but when he was 14 years old, he confessed to the whole family that he was gay. The closest cousins, if we had realized it, and became of our age, we accepted it without any problem. But there were some uncles that, for some stupid reason, stopped talking to him. At that moment, it was the grandparents, the ones we least expected, that ended up supporting him more. So something in me felt that it was the right thing to do, that he had the opportunity to hear the last words of his grandfather. However, minutes before I found Brian and I knew the truth about it. I hugged him and we both had tears in our eyes. He asked me to accompany him to his grandparents' house. I asked him to wait for Edouard, who was about to arrive, but he told me that there was no time. We left running and he drove, as I'd never seen him before, to my house, and on the way he told me everything. It had not been a coincidence. My grandfather wanted to talk to him when he felt that he didn't have much strength left. Among what Brian thought was incoherent, he told him clearly that he saw him hiding in the room with the candles. When he had to hide under the candles, he told him that he had seen Brian hiding, and he repeated it so that it wasn't his or Grandma's fault to keep the 46 candles lit. Those were his last words before he had asked him to go to the house to make sure that they didn't go out. At that moment we had arrived to the house, Brian told me that he didn't have to do it. I was also convinced that I was also had to be there, and when I went in with him, and although it was still early, the interior of the house and even the patio was getting darker and darker. I couldn't avoid looking at the angel, but I lowered my eyes this time. We ran to the candle room, and there were several about to be consumed, but there was one that had already disappeared completely. Brian asked me to help him look for more candles, and I went in with him to grandmother's room to take the shoebox, where we saw my grandfather take the candle before, and suddenly, at the end of the corridor, I saw a figure of a girl, with almost alert position. She was looking towards us. She had something like a light mist that didn't allow me to see her clearly, and that let her be just a silhouette, and didn't let me see her face clearly. Very strange darkness. I began to paralyze little by little, but when I came to my senses and began to accept that it was not one of my cousins, nor a neighbor or anything like that, I was saying something that, for some reason, I knew it had to go with the room behind my back. That silhouette of a girl suddenly ran towards me, and I also ran in the same direction, but to throw myself into grandmother's room to take the box and run to the room with the candles. We lit the one that was missing. We changed the others that were about to be consumed, and we counted again that there were 46. Something like a deep sigh we could hear all over the room, but we had no idea what the hell had just happened. We dialed Edouard, and he arrived a little later, accompanied by Lixon and Lucia, who insisted in accompanying them. As he could, Brian told them about grandfather, and I tried to say what I had just seen in the hallway, but they didn't seem to pay attention to me. Suddenly, in the middle of the sadness and confusion, a ghostly vision seemed something silly to talk about. Only Lucia seemed to have paid attention to me, while Edouard and Lixon tried to convince us that we were affected by the death of grandfather and that everything was a nervous breakdown. Lucia walked to the candle room, and I shouted when I realized that she was doing, and she took a candle and blew it out. Brian looked at her, screamed, and scared. That's what I thought at that moment. Brian screamed, and I realized that it was a sound. sound that first seemed like a scream, then a cry, and then something futuristic. While we all turned to all sides trying to identify the origin, it was changing to something even stranger. A kind of hoarse growl so low that we could feel the vibrations in our chest. When we heard that sound drop, the dining room light came on the other side of the courtyard. We saw a silhouette come rushing in. I was sure I had to be imagining it, because that silhouette was impossible to be real. First I thought it was a very thin, shirtless man, but as he ran and entered the dining room door of more than 2 meters and 50 tall, that silhouette crouched down as if he was too big that he couldn't even enter, so he had to crouch down. I was about to ask the others if they saw it too when Edward and Lixon ran out at full speeds towards the street door. Brian ran to light the candle that Lucia still had in her hands. I have to say, Brian, as if trying to calm down, when I asked him what he meant, he answered scared to me. And although I understood it, until I knew what the hell was going on, he would have to stay in that house to make sure that 46 candles were lit. That Tuesday at approximately 6 o'clock in the afternoon, I arrived with a suitcase to accompany Brian, who had already arrived in the morning. Nobody cared. All the uncles thanked us for the gesture of taking care of the house, with the exception of Uncle Rodolfo. It was said that the grandparents had decided to inherit the house to him for being the last one to have left it and for being the one who had not been able to buy one of his own. Uncle Rodolfo surprised us that same night when he arrived at dinner time and settled in Grandma's room. He brought dinner for the three of us, and he tried to pretend that he came to the house in a friendly way. His presence, more than bothering us, it made it impossible for us to continue investigating about the room and what we had seen the next day. Grandpa died, and even more so. We were in a tremendous panic, and to our bad luck, the sound of a clock, which was in the hallway to the bedrooms, but the sound of bells was heard in the hallway, and the three of us began to talk about 12 at night, but the sound of bells reached every corner of the house, and it made our hair stand on end. At that moment, as if hidden in the sound, I heard clearly that something fell. It was a sharp blow, like someone falling out of bed. In my imagination, that sound came from the candle room, but it couldn't have come from one of the bedrooms. My Uncle Rodolfo seemed to not have heard anything, but my eyes met Brian's. He had also heard. My uncle got up to the kitchen and Brian approached me. I changed several candles, but I kept them in Grandma's room. We'll have to take care of them out of there. I noticed that they were burning faster than normal. I don't know what it could mean. We kept silent when my uncle returned. He said goodbye to us and went to sleep, and the two of us settled, each one of us in an armchair. We felt strange because of what we saw days before in that same room, where we are now. We tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop seeing the total darkness that formed in the corners. Just when I was beginning to fall asleep, when I felt my eyes heavy, and for a moment I began to dream, a noise in the central patio made me open my eyes again. A loud noise, someone running among the flower pots, moving them. I wanted to think it was a dream because I was terrified by the idea of the angel in the garden moving, and several times as a child I had nightmares where this angel chased me around the house. I felt a tremendous fear that literally hurt my heart. Then I looked at Brian with my eyes almost bulging with horror and made a sign to me not to make any noise. I'm sure of what was there then. I could swear by the memory of my grandparents. It was the silhouette of the little angel looking at me with that angelic smile. It's clearly visible. Suddenly, Brian jumped up and screamed, running towards that silhouette that, in one movement, disappeared running down the hallway. We heard the steps with total clarity before getting lost in the bedrooms. We ran and found him terrified in the hallway in the middle of the three doors. We asked him what was happening, and the look on his face, as if he had seen a ghost or someone, had just entered his grandfather's room. I thought it was one of you. Meanwhile, I tried with all my strength not to look towards the patio. To my bad luck, that figure in the center was seen from all possible angles. I think that more of the fear of seeing him at that moment, I could stand the idea of turning around and his place was empty. The three of us were in shock until Brian slowly opened the door. It had only opened a few centimeters when someone pushed it violently from the inside. My uncle, from the shock, shouted maybe all the rude things he knew and ran out of the kitchen, shouting that he was going to get a knife and that he would see whoever was in there. Brian took advantage and opened the candle room where he saw that one of them was off. Ran to Grandma's room, took out the candles and lit one, replacing the one that had already gone out and left the rest of the candles in the corner, while I heard a laughter coming from Grandpa's room. When suddenly fell, my uncle ran past me, pushing me out of the way and opening the door to Grandpa's room with a bang. He checked everywhere but found nothing inside the room. We spent the next few hours until dawn telling him everything that had happened since Grandma's death. We had to go to sleep, my uncle said, and in the afternoon we'll think about what to do. I spent half the afternoon since 11 in the morning when I woke up delivering orders from one point to another in the city. At times I forgot everything, and at times my life was like anyone else's. Like all the people around me, and that I wished at about 5 in the afternoon, I moved towards the neighborhood, continuing to think about what awaited me at my grandpa's house. When I arrived at the gate, I ran into Doña Mercedes, a lady who helped my grandparents with the housework during their last years. She gave me her blessing and left in a hurry. When Brian and my uncle came in, they had gallons of holy water on the dining room table, strange artifacts, crucifixes, and Bibles. They scared Doña Mercedes, and I told them, no, she brought all this, and said Brian, I thought it didn't look good. I asked them what she had told them, and Brian said, I just thought it didn't look good. And I asked them what she had told them, and Uncle Rodolfo said not to worry. They were incoherencies and fantasies of the lady. Seriously, I asked her, after everything that had happened to us here, let's say the lady has fantasies. She says they're goblins. Brian said she didn't see them running from the patio to the candle room. She doesn't know what's up with the room either. When she came to the grandparents, they already had it like that. I went to the living room to leave my things that the goblins sounded absurd, but in the house, in that place, in those circumstances, they thought of something out of the normal was enough to terrify me, and that blessed angel smiled towards me in his normal position, but with something different on his face. Angel came on to let's do an experiment and look at this. I didn't like how Brian's words sounded. They opened the door to the candle room, and my uncle, who took one of the small candles, blew it out. The lights flickered for a moment as if there was an overload of electricity, and the flames of the candles trembled, as if someone was breathing near them. I felt a coldness in my back, as if it was coming from a wind from a long corridor, in spite of the lights being on. Because of the way it was built, the house always kept its corners particularly dark. Nothing happened. Before my Uncle Rodolfo could finish that sentence, in an attack of my nerves, my uncle lit the candle and left it on the table. It didn't take 2 seconds for the footsteps to stop, and they wanted us to keep them lit. Let's leave them like this, said my uncle. Whatever they are, they get angry when we put out the candles. Tomorrow, I'm going to look for the priest. He locked the room with the candles and took his things. Stay in the house if you want, but don't get in here. See you tomorrow. After saying that, he just arrived and he left. Brian, however, seemed to not pay attention to him. He seemed concentrated. I don't think they get angry because of the candles. At first, I didn't understand why he whispered what I asked him, and I don't think they get angry because of the candles. I think they prefer them off, don't you think? I don't think you understand the truth. There were 2 more candles about to be finished, at least the ones I could see from the candle room. I didn't understand the truth, I told him. There were 2 more candles about to be finished, at least the ones I could see from here. Let's see if they go out. Saying that, he went back to the kitchen and started pouring holy water all over the house. I really didn't know how safe it was to stay there, but what I did know was that I didn't have to leave him alone. So I called Edouard. Well, the only truth is that I didn't want to be alone. Edouard reluctantly agreed to come because he was very scared. He arrived at about 10 o'clock, he said, because he had a lot of things to do in the house. Because he had many things to do in the store, and well, I knew it was not a pretext because he was helping his father in a small hardware store they had. We had been having bread and milk for dinner when Edouard arrived. He arrived later than he had promised and tried to convince us to leave, to let Uncle Rodolfo deal with it. If he wanted to keep the house, it's not about what is left, but about what it is, said Brian. This was the grandparents' house, and we all have memories here. We all grew up here. It belongs to everyone. Whatever comes out of that room, we arrived before, or maybe Edouard didn't finish. Maybe that was from before. We were silent for a while and tried to finish dinner. A while later, a deep sigh seemed to come from the room of the candles. There was some about to be finished, and Brian said to Edouard, "We want to see what happens if we leave it like this." A murmur then started to go through the house. Brian and Edouard walked towards the hallway, and I got up to leave my plate in the sink. When I got to the sink, the murmur got louder. It seemed to come out of the pipes. I don't know if it was another language, but I couldn't understand it. But I couldn't stop looking at the pipe. I took off the screen that protects it, and the murmur dropped for a moment, as if it had been surprised. Then, a moment later, it continued as if nothing. I could almost see an eye peeking out from inside there. That's my imagination, I thought. Nervous, I walked down the hall to look for my cousins. Then I realized that someone had turned off all the lights. Only in the kitchen where I was, there was light. Another sigh came from the room, the other candle, I thought, and ran down the hall. When I turned around to head towards the living room dining room area, I saw what seemed to be a woman running towards me. A woman dressed as a bride. Maybe it was my imagination because it was very dark, or it could have been anything. I only remember that instead of going straight, it turned right into the hallway that was towards the street, and it went out to it. I'd like to have everything to change at that moment. That's when I went out to the street, everything would be over, and life would go as normal. But the truth was that the atmosphere became very heavy, and with a very strong smell of sulfur. It seemed to flood everything outside, and fill the whole street. The only thing that occurred to me was to go and knock on the door of the neighbor Madeleine. I liked her very much. I trusted her. Madeleine had tried her luck in the United States since she was old enough to work. She had saved enough money to buy a property in that town when she returned to the country and restored it little by little. She was not even 35 and she was already fulfilling her dream. I repeat, I liked her very much in that the moment she was only ready to find a way to escape from the house when she opened the door, I realized that I had not thought of any excuse. I asked her for her number because I had lost mine, I told her, and I needed to make a call. She told me to go to her house. Even she was looking for her cell phone. I noticed her discomfort because of the time, but there was time later to apologize. She asked me how I lost my cell phone, and I told her that the power had gone out at my grandparents' house. "Well, look, I am back," she said. She pointed to me at the window of the room and overlooked the street. A room that was closed most of the time that Grandma used to knit one of her favorite hobbies, her silhouette. The silhouette of the grandmother was drawn perfectly at that moment, using the sewing machine. It looked so clear through the curtain that it seemed to have a projector behind. The silhouette suddenly turned towards us, and from the door of the house I saw Brian and Edouard running towards us. The silhouette stopped and changed completely. I can assure that she had that wedding dress. That was the woman I had seen minutes before in the hallway. Although Madeleine didn't know anything more about what had happened in those days, and evidently we didn't tell her anything, she's a witness of what happened at that moment of that silhouette. Besides that, she walked all night in that room, and that night none of us could return. My mom went to pick up some things from the house, and I didn't find out until the afternoon. I asked her why she had gone without telling me anything, and she answered that she didn't need to tell me to get to her parents' house. Evidently, I couldn't answer anything. My mom had gone with my cousin Lucia, and they had been in the house all morning. "Didn't you see or hear anything strange?" I asked her. "Besides the mess you guys left, nothing." And the whole house felt very cold, and I saw what the grandparents did with the room they had been talking about. It's even scary, and in the danger of so many candles lit there, I answered. I asked her about the candles. My mom told me that Lucia had entered and lit some. She told me with something unimportant, without knowing what it meant to us, and at that moment, I sent a message to Lucia to ask her what had happened, why the hell she hadn't told me anything. I arrived at my grandparents' house very early at about 7 in the morning. The old ladies who lived in the neighborhood were cleaning the front of their houses, moments that they commonly took advantage of to talk. The morning breeze was still in the air. For a moment, I stood there in front of the house without daring to enter. I missed my grandmother as never before, and even looking from the opaque window of the living room that she used to sew, I could still see her figure as every time I visited her.